of China and India and the other Asian societies has finally provided them a model where you can grow fast economically and keep your cultural identity. You don't lose it. And so the modernization of China and India is going to have a tremendously positive impact on the Islamic world also. So you can see that there's a lot of good news coming from the rise of Asia. But of course, it is not just good news that comes. There's also bad news that comes. So what's the bad news? And here the bad news is something that I try to put across very delicately, because I know some of it can be quite painful. In fact, as I explained in the introduction to my book, many of my Western friends will find it difficult to read my book. It's an uncomfortable book to read. In fact, my wife told me not to publish it. She said, Kishore, you're going to lose many of your friends after you publish this book. But at the same time, if you're entering a new era of world history, you cannot just do it comfortably on the basis of your old mindset. You've got to change your mindset. You've got to get out of your established conventional patterns of thinking. And that's what the book tries to do. And the reason why I had to, in a sense, write these things very painfully is because I have a few unpalatable things to say to a Western audience, Let me give you an example of one piece of bad news. Now, the first piece of bad news is that the West has traditionally assumed, whenever it looks at problems out there in the world, it assumes that the West is there always providing the solutions and the rest of the world is creating the problems. The solutions are in the West, the problems are out there. Well, even today, the West still remains the source of many solutions to world problems. That's still a reality. But increasingly, the West is becoming a large part of the problem. And the reason why the West is becoming a large part of the problem is because you have occupied so much political and economic space in the world that you've accumulated over 200 years. And the rest of the world was passive and accepted it. Now the West has got to learn to share power, has got to learn to cede positions of dominance it has in many organizations, and that's not going to be easy. People who occupy privileged positions never give up power easily, whether it's an individual position or a regional position or national position. You just don't give up power easily. And if you want simple examples, I'll give you some easy ones. Take for example, look at Washington DC, where you have the two most powerful international economic organizations in the world, the IMF and the World Bank. Till today you have a rule that says to become the head of the IMF, you must be a European. To become the head of the World Bank, you must be an American. And guess what? 3.5 billion Asians don't qualify to run the IMF or the World Bank, even though they have the world's fastest growing economies, they have the world's largest pool of foreign reserves, trillions of dollars, and they're now producing more economics PhDs than the West does. But we're not qualified to run the IMF or the World Bank. Now you might think it's an easy thing to fix, but this, as recently as 2007, barely a year ago, you changed both the heads of the IMF and the World Bank. And guess what? Not one Western leader stood up and said the obvious thing. Hey, times have changed. We can no longer dominate these organizations. It is time we learn to share the management of the world with the rest of the world. Instead, there was another obscene rush to keep the positions to themselves. And that's dangerous. Because if you continue to hog on to positions that you accumulated in the past, when you had a much greater share of global GNP, global power, and you insist on keeping them, then the West becomes the problem. Another example, obvious one, the UN Security Council, which is the world's most powerful, international political organization. You have 5 permanent members. And by the way, I believe that the idea of a veto and permanent membership is a good one. I'm not saying it's bad. because I think it's important to give the great powers of the day a stake in remaining in the United Nations, so that the United Nations doesn't die and go the way of the League of Nations, where the United States walked away. So the veto is a functional thing. But I think what the Founding Fathers had in mind was that you're supposed to entrench the great powers of the day and not the great powers of yesterday in the UN Security Council. And today the only qualification to become the permanent member of the UN Security Council is that you must have won World War II in 1945. And even though you're going to have very soon, I mean, the Europeans have announced it, come January 2009, there'll be a common European foreign policy, finally a common one phone number to call in Europe for Henry Kissinger to find out what's European foreign policy, great leap forward. Then the logical solution is, let's have a common European seat in the Security Council. Why do you need a British seat and a French seat? Right? It's an obvious anachronism. But try to persuade London or Paris. Just go down there and say, come on guys, be reasonable. Your time has passed. Let's move on. And do you think they'll agree? I mean, it is things as simple as this that illustrate how the West is increasingly becoming a large part of the problem. And I can apply this to many other situations. I was in London with Sir Howard Davis, the director of London School of Economics, and he said you have something called the Basel Committee. It has got 13 members. Out of the 13, 10 are European. It excludes China, includes Luxembourg. I mean, what's going on here? Right? What kind of world order is this? How do you have a world order based on this sort of thing? So I can go after organization after organization. So increasingly, unless the West realizes that it is becoming the force that is blocking change, right? We're not going to move ahead. But the second piece of bad news, and this is the hardest part for me to say, is that the West, in a sense, many people in the West accepted many people in the rest of the world accepted Western domination of the world because it was seen to be, in many ways, still relatively competently run. In fact, West provided the models of competence for the world. Now, if you go back to my earlier point about how the rest of the world is emulating Western best practices, that's an example of competence. And by the way, I have to emphasize that domestically, Western societies are still the most competently run societies in the world. Still, I mean, for all your problems in the United States or in Europe, these are the models for the rest of the world to copy and to follow. So domestic competence is still, the West is far ahead. But what's surprising is that these states which are being run competently domestically are now performing incompetently on various international and global issues. And that's what basically the article in the magazine Foreign Affairs is all about. I give 4 examples of incompetence. I've touched on a couple of them here. The first one, the most obvious one, of course, if you look at the relations within the West and the Islamic world. I mean, I believe there's no necessary reason why you should have tensions between the West and the Islamic world. There is no fundamental clash of civilizations between the West and Islam. But there are specific Western policies that have generated anger in the Islamic world. So policies can be fixed. And that's the good news. But the bad news is that many of these policies are not easy to fix. I mean, if you look at the obvious examples of incompetence, the one that is you can mention is number one. If you look at the Middle East peace process, it's been going on now for I don't know how long. But as long as the Israel-Palestine issue continues, you're going to have huge problems within the West and Islam. And the tragedy here is that we now have an opportunity where we can